and for a really great discussion. So I'm Hazel Tomlin, one of the co-leads of the Inventories and NDC network of the GRA, and our core objective is to facilitate international and national links across research institutes, government and agriculture organisations, ultimately to improve national inventories and the mitigation and NDCs they inform. We just announced the next webinar on national agriculture inventory data collection and management. You'll be able to register for that webinar in the Zoom window following the closure of this webinar, as long as you keep that open. And we'll also link the GRA website announcement in the chat. So some quick housekeeping. This session will begin with key points from each of our speakers, followed by a panel discussion covering your questions. Please write your questions in the Q&A box. We'll not be monitoring the chat function for questions. It's my pleasure to hand over the floor to Hayden Montgomery as the GRA Special Representative and Webinar Chair to provide an overview of the GRA. And many of you may already know, Hayden is transitioning to Agriculture Program Director of the Global Methane Hub. So I'm really glad we managed to catch him before he's fully transitioned, although I'm quite sure he will continue to work very closely with the GRA moving forwards. The floor is yours, Hayden.
Thank you, Hazel, and good day, good evening to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be able to chair this webinar. As Hazel mentioned, I'm still the GRA's special representative, but I'm moving to a new role with the Global Methane Hub over the next few months. Look, today we have a really great lineup of speakers. We're going to hear from people involved in the research community, involved in the agricultural sector, and involved in the policy arena, in particular with our speakers involved in the international climate negotiations, but who are also active, of course, in their own national and regional policy discussions. I will just introduce the panelists to you all to start with before we invite our first speaker. So today, joining us, we have, as I mentioned, a really great list. We have Dr. Marta Alfaro from the Chilean Agriculture Research Organization, INEA, and Marta's the team leader involved in the compilation of the Chilean Agricultural Inventory. We also have, in the research domain, we have Alvaro Roel, who's from the National Institute of Agricultural Research of Uruguay, and Alvaro is a researcher in the National Rice Research Program of INEA. I should mention that both Marta and Alvaro have functions in the GRA currently. Marta is our chair of the GRA Council. This is the year in which Chile is acting as our chair, and Alvaro has been for a number of years one of the co-chairs of the Paddy Rice Research Group of the GRA. Then we have Brenna Grant, who's the Executive Director of Canfax and Canfax Research Services, which are research divisions of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. We also have with us Brian Lindsay, who's the Director of the Dairy Sustainability Framework and the Global Sector Lead of the Global Dairy Platform. And then from our policy arena, we have Herwig, who's the Coordinator for Climate Change as part of the Directorate General of Agriculture and Rural Development of the European Commission, and Herwig following and leading for Europe in the negotiations on agriculture within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And last but not least, George Wamukoya, who leads the African group of negotiators expert support network called AGNES, and has been involved for many years as a chair and lead negotiator in the UN climate change negotiations on agriculture and a number of other topics. So as you can see, we have a really strong panel here, and each will bring their own perspective of this really interesting topic we're bringing to you today. So I don't want to take up much more time in the introductions. I will just invite Marta to start off with her presentation and invite her to share her slides. Once we have finished with our panelists' presentations, we will have a lot of time for discussion. So I hope that many of you I can see in the audience, many of whom I know are very much involved in this topic, will also bring your perspectives and interesting questions to drive this discussion over the coming hour and a half, just under now. So Marta, thanks for joining. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hayden, and thank you to the organizer for making me part of this initiative. Should be able to see my presentation now.
I will just confirm when we can.
Can you see it?
It's yes. There you go.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. As Hayden was mentioning, this presentation is focused on the key points we should keep in mind when talking about greenhouse gas inventories. So, as we are all aware, all countries around the world have established targets for mitigation, in particular in what we will be discussing today, those related to the agriculture. So many countries have established targets for 2050, and 90% of the UNFCCC countries targets are for the 2050 framework. And what is important here is that the only official document a country has internationally to provide advances in relation to these targets are the national inventories. So the national inventories then were developed underneath the umbrella of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. To estimate the inventories, there is a common set of rules and a standard methodology that was developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we cannot use any methodology to estimate the inventories. This is a fixed methodology that accounts for the reporting of anthropogenic emissions and removals. The inventory should cover a sequence of years, which is usually known as a time series. And for each year, emissions are accounted on a calendar year basis. And the inventory includes a common set of reporting tables, as well as a written document, which comprises all the methodology and data used for the estimation. So in relation to the methodology, the emissions are estimated using activity data and emission factors. Activity data is the information on the extent to which a human activity takes place, and the emission factor is the coefficient that reflects the emissions per unit of that activity. All inventories should follow what is called the TAC principle, and this includes transparency. So all information should be sufficient and clear documented for everyone to understand how estimations were made. Accurate, which means that the inventory should not underestimate emissions or overestimate removals as far as it can be judged. Completeness, which means the inventory should include all relevant categories, gases, and geographical areas relevant to a specific party. It has to be consistent, which means that the estimation in different gases or different categories or across the years has to be clear and consistent over the year, so that the final value we see reflects difference in emissions and not in the methodology. And finally, one of the main objectives of the inventories and why we use a common methodology is that we want to be able to compare the evolution of inventories over the years and across parties. So there are different methodologies that can be used to estimate the inventories. We go from a very basic methodology or tier 1 to a more enhanced methodology, and we will review what are the main differences. The tier 1 is the default methodology included in the IPCC guidelines. It uses a very basic description of activity data, and the emission factors are available in the guidelines generated by the IPCC. Then we have a level 2 or intermediate, which is a requirement, it's a shall requirement according to the reporting guidelines for all key categories in each country. It has a more disaggregated information on activity data and can use or implement country-specific emission factors. And because of that, it may reflect the effect of mitigation actions implemented in the country. And finally, a tier 3, or what is called a higher tier, which is totally adapted to reflect national circumstances. It usually includes the use of the specific models. And of course, because of the last 2 points, it reflects the impact of mitigation action. So as a short example, if we want to estimate emissions from the use of nitrogen as fertilizer in a specific party, then we could have only the total amount of urea used in the agricultural sector, for instance, and applied the conversion to nitrogen. I used the emission factor, the default emission factor provided by the guidelines, and we will have an overall estimation of emissions in this category. If we were talking about the tier 2, then we could have, for instance, how that fertilizer is distributed in different cropping systems, or applied a country-specific emission factor, which is the case of Chile, for instance. And in a tier 3, where we will see that the same emission will be estimated as a function of different fertilizers being used, different cropping systems, different soil types, different climatic conditions, or use country-specific emission factors. So this is the difference. In all 3 cases, you're estimating the emission from this category, but the level of disaggregation is different. And of course, if you have implemented mitigation action only in these 2 possibilities or in these 2 tiers, you will be seeing the effect of those mitigation actions in your overall estimations. So this is the relevance of improving your inventory from a very basic level of estimation to a more disaggregated level of estimation. So what we need to keep in mind is that, as I mentioned, inventory is the only official reporting document to provide evidence of how mitigation actions are having an effect in overall emissions in your party. Second, that there is a standard methodology and rules to estimate emission. There is different methodologies available globally, but for the inventories, there is a specific methodology already set up that we need to follow. Third, if an adequate level of disaggregation is available in your inventory, you will be able to reflect the effect of mitigation actions implemented in the country. And that is one of the main reasons of why our countries should move to higher tiers when estimating the national inventories. Then an inventory doesn't need to be perfect. You need to start somewhere. What we need to understand is that all parties, all countries need to start to improve the inventory at some point. And this will be a continuous effort that will take us, and there's a lot of work for many years, so you don't have to worry about it. And finally, you need to collaborate with other actors to have the proper information, to have a detailed inventory that will reflect the effect of mitigation actions in the country. And with it, I will leave it up to here, Hayden, for the next panelist.
Great, thank you, Marta. Excellent, very clear differentiation there between the different tiers, which is really, really helpful for the rest of this discussion and event. Alvaro, I would invite you now to take the floor and share your presentation, please. And while you're doing that, I'll just remind people, if you have questions, please use the question and answer function within Zoom, and we can make sure those questions are captured. And then once we finish the presentations, we can start to take some of those. Okay, Alvaro, yes, we see your presentation.
Right, thank you, Hayden. Good day to everybody. As was mentioned, I came from the rice sector, so I feel a little bit out of focus here with this cattle looking at me. But I'm going to take from the last comment that Marta mentioned regarding the need of collaboration between actors, and I will try to touch to concepts related to this. The first one is the need of the importance of the institutional arrangement. Basically, as Marta showed, we are talking of a data intensive driving process where data is transformed into knowledge and this into action. But in this transformation, there are many participants involved. There are people from the government, farmers, industries, and researchers. And each of them have their own specific motivation to participate on this, but do not necessarily have a common denominator, I would say. So I think that at country level, it's very important to develop a common place where data is used and exchanged with rules and conditions. And this, most of the time, is what we leave it for the end, to think about this organizational innovation that guarantee that all actors are talking, understanding, and more important, sharing challenge and opportunities. No? I think an example can be that, like the institution where I work, that, you know, within the same institution, there are representatives from farmers, from the governments, and from the researchers. The second point that I would like to address is the linking synergies. Is the need to emphasize on linking the synergy from the different components, you know, from the policy component, from the sustainability sides, but also from the production, efficiency, and profitability sector. I think we have a communication challenge to better explain that all these concepts are connected. As Marta's mentioned, there is a significant increase in the demand for local data, and this will continue in the future, and it will be even getting more complex about this. So what we are doing, we are increasing, you know, the knowledge about emission factors, removals, opportunities, carbon sequestration. So the more we know about these things, the better we know about the sustainability of our sectors, regardless the importance of the inventories. And if we connect this with the fact that many times, not always, but many times, working, you know, in this efficiency, removal, sequestration, give us light to the efficiency that we have in our own agricultural system. And this is many times linked to the profitability. So the challenge is connecting these three issues from the communication point of view. So an example that we always mention or we talk about is a cattle herd that have less cows that are not pregnant compared to another one that have more cows that are not pregnant. The first one, you know, is more productive, have a low carbon footprint per unit of production, let's say beef, but also most of the time is also more profitable. So we need to deliver this connection. So my point is that we need to keep working to better communicate this connection in the chain. Why I highlight this point is because if we view it in this way, in this integrated way, there will be much more interest from all actors to advance in this matter. So finally, don't take for granted that the data will flow smoothly. There is a need to invest some time and effort on developing best organizational architecture to achieve this goal. Don't leave it to the end. We need to highlight this connection between climate sustainability, agricultural sustainability, and profitability. Agriculture is part of the solution, and this solution can also improve its profitability. So at the end, the way farmers will get involved in this is conditionally if they perceive some kind of incentive. We cannot ignore this. I leave from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvaro. That's a very clear message and a great transition to our next panelist, who will speak from the perspective of the farmers and the producers and some of the work that's going on there. So I'll invite Brenna Grant to take the floor. I don't believe you have a presentation, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hayden. So Canfax Research Services provides secretariat services to the Canadian beef advisors. And the beef advisors are made up of the 7 national beef organizations and are responsible for Canada's beef strategy. And in 2020, they created a suite of goals going out to 2030. And these were designed to be ambitious stretch goals that would push us to reach for something that we wouldn't if we hadn't set the goals. However, we also wanted any goals that were set to be grounded in reality of what could feasibly be achieved by industry. And we did some scenario analysis to look at what could we achieve in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, as well as carbon sequestration in sort of a business as usual case if we continue to have the long-term trends for advancements in various areas that we know are contributing to incremental reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But we also wanted to look at some ambitious improvements in adoption rates, as well as breakthroughs in technology. And it was actually the major breakthrough scenario of reducing primary production greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 33% that was adopted by industry. And what was interesting about this was at the time of creating the goals, it aligned with when the government was in their process of updating their international commitments. And this really facilitated conversations between industry and government, but due to both processes running at the same time, it was hard to align due to confidentiality of each of the processes because they were both in motion. In the end, industry published their goals first, and we are aligned somewhat on terms of greenhouse gas reduction, where government came out with a 30% reduction, but not in terms of their methane reduction goal, which is 45%. Since the goals have been announced, both industry and government are looking for ways to reach the goals, and it has encouraged conversation about what's really needed to accomplish them. And we really have three main areas that we talk about. The first is continued research in making those incremental improvements in primary production, because those are absolutely necessary even to reach the business as usual scenario. But we also need to be investing in innovation that can lead to some of those major breakthroughs in technology that are really going to move us forward. And when we think about some of those major breakthroughs, once they are discovered and are available, we need regulatory approval. And as new products come to market, that they need to become available for producers. And an example of this is 3NOP, which has great potential to close the gap between our 17% reduction for our business as usual case and our goal of 33%. However, we estimate that that alone will not be enough. So approvals are absolutely needed in order to keep up with the global community, which is moving quickly in this area. But we also need to continue investing in research so that we can continue to close that gap to reach our goal. The third area is monitoring and validation. We have the Canadian Roundtable's National Beef Sustainability Assessment, which measures environmental, social, and economic areas for the beef industry every 5 to 7 years. And so this provides a great platform specifically for our emissions piece of things. But we also have a goal to increase carbon sequestration by 3.4 million metric tons per year by 2030. And we need a way to measure and monitor this at a broad scale across Canada. Right now, there's lots of work being done at the research level, which is small scale, and it's how do we scale this up so that we actually can make statements nationally in this area. And so that's a real big focus for us. I'm also working with the Global Roundtable of Sustainable Beef and their Climate Working Group. And again, when they set their 2030 goals, we wanted to find a balance between what was realistic and what was ambitious. And on the whole question of monitoring, in February, the GRSB launched their carbon footprint guideline for beef to encourage alignment of benchmarks, but also mitigation studies. And this is to enhance clarity on which mitigation options are effective and reduce questions around methodology differences. But we also have to identify what are effective mitigation options that are applicable regionally, because they're not always going to be the same? And then how do we scale them to such an extent that they show impact when measured? And this is using lots of different ways to communicate value of adopting these different practices to producers, looking at the cost benefit for them, and both financial as well as some of those intangible benefits that they see. So I'll leave it there, Hayden, and turn it back to you.
Great, Brenna, thank you. And yeah, you've brought in some extra dimensions there, of course, the regulatory process, really important. Now, Brian, I'll pass to you to carry on with the industry theme, and you can share your slides when you are ready. I'll let you know when we see them properly.
Unmute myself. Okay, good to go.
Yep, we can see those.
Great. Thanks to the GRA for giving us the opportunity to share this with us already. I've written down notes and notes of stuff I've learned, so it's been great to be part of this. Even when you work in this space, you come on a meeting like this, you realise how little you know. So I'm Brian Lindsay. Yes, as Hayden said, I'm the Director of the Dairy Sustainability Framework, and I also represent Global Dairy Platform as their sector lead for sustainability. Global Dairy Platform is a membership organisation for the dairy industry, focusing predominantly on dairy development activities, sustainability, hence they're part of the Dairy Sustainability Framework, and nutritional aspects of dairy. I just want to start off with a bit of context about the dairy industry because the work we do is global. The Dairy Sustainability Framework is a global organisation representing and monitoring and reporting on about 30% of global milk production. The dairy industry globally is 1 billion people strong. Okay, it's a big industry. We have 600 million living on dairy farms. Another 400 million people are supported by full-time jobs in relation to dairy farming, and another 240 million people who are employed directly or indirectly in the dairy sector. So we've got 133 million dairy farms globally. We have 37 million dairy farms led by women, 80 million women employed in dairy farming, FAO stats. It's number 1 by volume globally in terms of trading globally, and number 3 in terms of value. So dairy accounts for about 14% of global ag trade. So we have a role, we have a responsibility to play in this space. The Dairy Sustainability Framework, as I mentioned, is about monitoring and reporting the continuous improvement, as Marta said at the beginning, the continuous improvement of the dairy sector globally. And as the other speakers have said, we don't just focus on greenhouse gas emissions. We cover the 3 pillars of sustainability, looking at the environment, the social, and the economic, and making sure and understanding the interactions between those. And that's part of the challenge we have. I was just speaking at a conference last week in Sweden, where all of us are working in sustainability, talking about sustainability, but the main focus was on greenhouse gas emissions only. We need to widen our blinkers and think about the interrelationships with the other aspects of the sustainability spectrum when we're working on these things. So I've just got one slide here to just talk you through my thinking on where we should be going with this. And I think we've got shared outcomes, and I'm talking about here industry, policymakers, government, and so forth. We all want food security. We all want emission reductions. We all want a profitable and efficient agricultural sector. We want global recognition for the activities we do in terms of managing and managing the environmental impacts of the industries we have. We need an efficient and versatile data collection and reporting system. And I'll come back to this in a minute because that's pretty important, because we have industry data, we have data that, as Marta beautifully talked about in terms of the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 requirements. We want a joined up approach and we want tangible impact. And I think that's critical from both policy perspectives as well as the farming perspectives. So let's break this down a bit. Let's look at the farming side of things. The dairy sector acknowledges change is necessary. Okay, and the thing we do all recognise on this call probably is that ag's at the interface, as Alvaro said. Ag is at the interface of climate change. It sees the impacts of climate change first, but it's also a contributor to climate change. And farmers are continuously adapting their systems to cater for climate change impact. So I can tell you on my place here, where I've got a few sheep, I know that my fly strike season has widened now. And literally, it's a month either side on the shoulders where I can now get fly strike. We have numerous demands from a range of different channels. And I think from an industry perspective and a policy perspective, we need to understand this. And it comes back to that point on the data collection and reporting system. So I just noted a few things down here that my companies that I work with would be involved with, like the Science-Based Target Initiative, corporate and social responsibility reporting, environmental social governance, global reporting initiative, carbon disclosure project. Are we making claims about our products? And regulation, as Brenna just talked about. We are collecting data for a range of different things. And my challenge to this discussion is how can we take the data that industry already has, get it with the right appropriate MRV and be used for policy decisions and policy reporting and things like that. How can we take this through industry initiatives like the Dairy Sector's Pathway to Dairy Net Zero initiative or the Dairy Sustainability Framework? And how can we take the data, use it and make it sweat more on behalf of the industry? So we're all working for those same shared outcomes. As we've already said, there's more than a single issue and more than a single solution, as was just said. And the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero program is certainly doing that now, linked with the GRA and FAO are exploring that. We're building different typologies, similar to what Brenna was saying, building different typologies of dairy production systems around the world, recognizing we have a diverse dairy sector. And then making sure that the mitigation strategies we put in place are going to have impact. It's as simple as that. Make sure we get the right impact, right strategies for the right challenge. From a farmer's perspective, we want data use being appropriate, and we want reassurance that the data is going to be used appropriately. And we talk about recognition and reward for positive impact. And I don't mean financial reward here. I've said this on many platforms where farmers will be happy if their data is going to show that they are contributing to a mitigation component of the nationally determined contributions. They are being part of the solution. Right at the moment, they feel like they're the cause of every problem. And that's the challenge we've got. And I would say that the dairy sector was not waiting until COP26 to act. I mean, COP26 seems to be the turning point where we've got the Global Methane Pledge and Aim for Progress and all these different initiatives coming up, very single focused. We're trying to have a broad approach. We've been doing work on this for a long time. With dairy sector published its first common methodology for life cycle assessment for greenhouse gases in 2010. So we've been working on this for a long time. We know we've got a long way to go. But it wasn't COP26 that pushed the dairy sector into this process. And from a farming perspective and an industry perspective, it's not about just where do we go next and just ticking the box. This is about preservation for the future. We talk about agriculture. We don't own the land. We're borrowing it from our grandchildren. If a dairy company doesn't have a sustainable supply of raw materials, we don't have a dairy company. So from a government perspective, and this is my own views, I mean, we've got to understand also when you look at certain strategies, even in the country where I live in England, where crazy decisions are being made by certain councils about what diet they have in their council canteens and things, all agriculture has impacts. We all need to change. Food security is one thing. We need to think wider than food security. The impact of that industry, we might solve food security issues, but we don't want to cause problems elsewhere. And it's not just about reporting. We often think government just wants to make sure they're meeting their targets. And I thought it was really great how Marta talked about the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. If we want an industry to change, we've got to get out of that tier 1 level, because if we're going to use data from farmers, and what are the implications of the data collection for farmers we need to know about, we need to get beyond that tier 1 so we can demonstrate we're having an impact. And we've got to recognize that we're working in biological systems. We have expertise in that, but it takes time for things to change. If you're talking feeding, you can get almost pretty quick change. But if you're talking about a genetics program, it's a long-term investment. I would encourage governments to get closer to industry. And as Brenna said, you know, get that symbiotic approach to those shared outcomes. Hayden, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Brian. Great stuff. I like you've brought on the dimension of recognition and reward doesn't necessarily mean financial. There are some questions in the Q&A that we'll come on to later that start to get at that sort of social dimension, which is really, really important, of course.
Probably all from farmers saying, why not the money?
And also like, you know, making the data sweat. That's a nice term phrase. Okay, so we'll move into the government sector now, and we'll hear from Herwig Brenna, if Herwig is available to give his intervention before passing to George, and then we'll open up for questions and answers. So Herwig, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, well, firstly, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, and I see in the public there's a couple of well-known faces as well. As I was introduced, I'm one of the people in the EU team negotiating at the climate negotiations. The next one is coming up 6th of June in Bonn. What is the importance of for the EU of the whole setup with the inventory? Well, it's the basic thing that we need, because we need to know what are our emissions and what are our removals, and we need a methodology for that. And luckily we have that. And because we know where our emissions are, we can then build policy. And in the case of the EU, this translates into firstly the European Green Deal that everybody maybe has heard about. There's also a climate law that is in place now. What it says in a nutshell is that we want to be climate neutral by 2050. That's a very ambitious goal. We have an NDC that covers the whole economy, so all sectors of the economy, including agriculture. And that means that we will have to put efforts in all sectors, and also agriculture will play its part. It's one of the only sectors where you can store carbon. So of course we need to look at what we can do there. And partly that's done by having a strategy which is called the farm to fork strategy, where we try to address the whole food system, and then also elements of the system like reducing nutrient losses by 50%, reducing fertilizer use by 20% by 2030, increasing the amount of organic agriculture carried out in the EU, and a list of other things that maybe most of you have heard about it already. Linked to that, we have a reform of the Common Agriculture Policy, which is going to be more sustainable than the last one, the parent one. So you will have 40% of the budget spent on sustainability. And for that, we have an interaction with the member states. We have what we call CAP strategic plans, where the member states will lay out what they plan to do. And then the Commission interacts with the member states to make sure that we have the best possible actions in the plans, and so also the best possible outcome. There's also a discussion on carbon farming, which has just started, so there's nothing much to report yet, but we look into it, how to incentivize farmers for storing carbon. So one of the topics that all links in, of course, with what we do at the negotiations. So the Coronivia joint work on agriculture, where we also try to motivate and incentivize everybody to look into possible actions to increase sustainability in the agriculture sector, but at the same time, not diminishing food security, making sure that people in developing countries, especially women farmers, but all farmers in developing countries actually can live from the activity. It's a bunch of issues that are bundled together in a sort of a work program, and we have reached the end of this work program. And now in Bonn, one of the things we need to do is to report back on what we did and try to tease out the most important issues and put them into a text, and then adopt this text at the next COP27 in Egypt. I don't know where I am time-wise, but I think that's a good summary and good intervention, and I should stop here, so to give the time to other people to intervene. Thank you.
Thanks, Herwig, and perhaps we can come back later and maybe you can elaborate a bit more on the Coronivia process and the relevance of that process to helping with an inventory process, you know, within countries. Okay, so we just have one more panel intervention and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So really great pleasure to invite George Wamukoya to take the floor. If George, you can send there your camera. There we go. And just a reminder to people before George kicks off that I'm seeing a number of questions coming in here, which is great. And you also have the opportunity to like questions that others have asked if you wish to see those asked first of the panelists. So please use that function as well. George, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Aidan. Great to see you there, and great to join the team. Very informative. From the African perspective, I will say the following. One is that agriculture is very critical to the economies, to the livelihoods, and it forms a big chunk of the exports for the countries, and therefore earning the forex. But also agriculture has been identified as one of the main sources of emissions based on one, the greenhouse gas inventories, as well as through the national communications that our countries have communicated. The effect of that, then it means that African countries must take steps in one way or another to address the main source of emissions, which is from the AFOLU sector. And that is where the problem starts, in the sense that one, if we take the example of the main source of emissions are from enteric fermentation, the livestock, then we have two categories of livestock keepers or farmers. One is the dairy, which Brian has talked about, and I think it's growing in Africa. But a large part of the livestock is free ranching, and more importantly, pastoralism. And we know that that has a lot of linkage with the culture of the people, and also it plays a very critical role in the livelihoods of those people. So when we're looking at the greenhouse gas inventory, then the challenge that we have is, do we have the capacity to deal with the pastoralists? And yet that is a large component of herds of livestock that in one way or another generate the emissions. In terms of dairy, I think there's a lot of effort, for example, in countries like Kenya, where regulatory frameworks are put in place to ensure that they report back on the emissions and change the way they're doing things. When I look at many of the African countries' NDCs, you'll find that one of the common themes there is new breeds, which then effectively means that they're dealing with the emissions as one way by which they will contribute. The other common feature there is the pasture, and I think pasture is a big issue in Africa. We have a very poor pasture, and as a consequence, you'll find that the emissions that emanate are quite not appropriate for the circumstances. Now, what does that mean in terms of policy? In terms of policy, you'll find that a number of countries are doing their sector-wide long-term low emission and climate resilient strategies, and we're involved in supporting 6 countries. And the interesting part of that is that when we're doing that, one is baseline. One of the challenges we had was the data. And I think that's why I like the presentation as was made with respect to tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And therefore, you'll find a large part of the work we rely on tier 1, which does not help us to reflect the national circumstances because of the emission factors that we're using. But I'm happy that through the partnerships with GRA and others, New Zealand government and others, there have been efforts to try to have a build capacity of a number of African experts on greenhouse gas inventories, particularly in the livestock sector, with a view of having a community of practice that could be reflected and cascaded across the continent. And I think that's the best way to do it, because we may not have that capacity in terms of resources and to help us do that. The other, and as a consequence, some countries have moved to tier 2. For example, Kenya now has moved, livestock has moved to tier 2, which I think is progressive, and we hope that partnering with the other institutions that are providing support, we'll be able to get as many countries to tier 2 as possible, and eventually a tier 3, so that we're able to reflect on our national data. So a key issue here is, in terms of policy, what's the data that will help you to make a decision that you're going to include that action? Number 2, of course, bear in mind that we have very many smallholder farmers, for example. It becomes expensive, really, to monitor, and an MRV framework that we put in place then becomes difficult to and very expensive, and therefore we have to think through as to how we are going to work with many African countries that have expressed interest in reducing emissions in the follow sector, and particularly livestock and agriculture, so that they are able to do that. And with respect to the long-term low emissions, we have a challenge in finding a balance, in the sense that if you do scenarios, you'll find that in many of our African countries, emissions will peak around 2070, 2080. But because of the decisions that we've had from particularly Glasgow, where the countries are encouraged to move to 2050, now, if I give an example of Kenya, when we had a meeting with our minister, he told us a decision has already been made, 2050. You scientists work backwards and tell us what you need to do. So you can see how sometimes policymakers get involved in the process, and once they understand the demand of the global community and where we want to go, then they can direct and influence the national processes. But overall, I think the key message that I want to leave with colleagues is that Africa, particularly livestock systems, are so diverse, and they will require different approaches if we have to deal with the issue of inventory and managing. Number 2, agriculture is particularly crop. Let's use the word crop. You'll find that our soils are very poor, and based on the Abuja Declaration of our heads of state in 2006, where it was decided that we increase the fertilizer use up to 50 kilograms per hectare. And therefore, that means that we need to go back to our heads of state and give them a new advice based on the new policies that have emerged international, for example, the Paris Agreement and the rest, so that they can give further direction as to whether that still remains applicable. But otherwise, we are very keen on the Coronivia because our Herwig has talked about it, and we're looking forward to engaging partners to see how we can institutionalize properly the agriculture within the UNFCCC, so that it can incentivize our farmers so that they can put food on the table, and more importantly, food security. Thanks very much, Hayden.
Thank you, George. That's really great. You've introduced some new dimensions there, the need for capability building, the very real challenges of pastoralism, which is, of course, very, I guess, an acute challenge in the context of Africa, but also in other regions where, grazing livestock systems take place, and it does present interesting challenges for quantification of emissions and implementation of mitigation. So that concludes the panel interventions, at least to begin with, and we have a number of questions lined up here. So I see some questions may well be being answered by our panelists, but there are a number that we'll take live. And we'll start with the highest ranked question, and it's a very good question, relating to the interaction between the different greenhouse gases within agricultural production systems. And the question is, we quite often focus on emissions factors for individual gases or sources of those gases. but we do have multiple gases in the system, and there can be trade-offs and synergies. And the question is, how important is this issue? I guess that's an important issue for sure. But maybe if I ask Marta, would she like to have a first comment on that one? And if the panelists could turn on the cameras, and then we can see everyone here, and then we can interact a bit more, and I can just direct questions to you. Or if you wish to jump in and answer the question, by all means, raise your hand. But if Marta, perhaps you could take this one to start with, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Hayden, and thank you for the question. Absolutely, I agree. I mean, it's a very difficult point, and emission factors are designed for one specific gas under any specific circumstance, so they necessarily reflect from the individual perspective on the exchange and synergies that we could find with other gases. But it is a very relevant point. That's we have seen over the years that a mitigation action, for instance, to reduce ammonia volatilization, that is to inject nitrogen onto the soil, may increase nitrous oxide emissions. So we need to look at the overall balance of gases from the perspective of an effective mitigation, I will say so. And that will take us probably to the conversation and the points made by Brian and Brenna, in the sense that we need to look at the system, not a particular practice, but as the system as overall. And another point we must not forget, I think, is this, what we are talking about, the interaction between different gases. You can also see it as a result of the interaction between adaptation measures and mitigation measures. So I think there are also offsets and synergies that can be explored, and we need to be aware of those. Everything takes time, as I think George mentioned. Everything takes time, and these are complex issues, but as long as we work together, I think there's a possibility that we can reach effective practices and technologies for the systems, not for any specific practice, as I mentioned.
I see Brian wants to jump in there too, but just a quick thing, Marta. Do you think that the issue of trade-offs and synergies between the different gases is more easily managed and understood at higher tiers of reporting? Do you think that, like, moving to tier 3 in part helps resolve some of the process aspects of the interaction between gases?
Yes, I agree, Hayden, because with the tier 1 approach, you use usually a default emission factor. So you have no chance of reflecting the interactions or synergies or offsets between the practices and the effect of different gases. So that's something you will see only if you move to tier 2 or to tier 3. And it makes it more complex, because it's not only something that you need to develop for the main gas, let's say nitrous oxide emission, but you need to look at leaching losses in relation to nitrogen, or ammonia losses in relation to nitrogen, which are other emission factors. So, and many times we have, particularly in developing countries, I will say, because in some developed countries you have a normative associated to ammonia volatilization, for instance, which is quite strict, but in other parts of the world that's not available. So ammonia volatilization is not a problem, and ammonia is not a greenhouse gas per se. It can, in turn, over 100 years, contribute to nitrous oxide emissions, but it's not in the main focus at the moment in developing countries because of what we're discussing. So definitely, it's something that with tier 2 or tier 3 you could start to look at. But as I said, it's a long-term interactions, and it's not only for one practice, that you need to look at the systems as well.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. Brian, you want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, just from an industry perspective, if I may, and the split gas approach, or understanding how the individual gases behave, has been a huge learning for our own industries over the last couple of years, predominantly brought about by the concept out of Oxford GWP style methodology for looking at methane and quantifying short-lived climate pollutants in the atmosphere. But that's been good in a way. It's been seen by many in the industry as a silver bullet, which it isn't, we know that. But at the same time, it's made us have the conversation and made us think about how the different gases behave. And if you look at the work that the GRA and FAO have done for us on our different dairy farming typologies around the world, we recognise that the pastoralist system has a very different emissions profile to those in the US type-based system. So we're already starting to talk about the different gases and how to mitigate the individual gases. It's important, yes, as Marta says, about the interactions between the two. But if we're going to have the impact we need to have that understanding. So we're getting there. A lot of it is about managing the expectations of our own industry, about what we're capable of achieving as well. So it's all about understanding. So I'd support totally what Marta said. Right. George, jump in.
Thanks, Aidan. Maybe I reframe the question from the African perspective. We've been looking at how do we enhance synergies? Let's use the word adaptation and mitigation. And if you look at Article 4, paragraph 4, it talks about the adaptation actions with mitigation co-benefits. So the question I wanted to find out is from the Marta, from the presentation that you've made, at what stage are we able to identify those actions that may be adaptation in nature, but with mitigation co-benefits, so that they can be part of the NDC, accounted for in the NDC?
That's a great question. And you mentioned the analysis of NDCs that you've done. And when one looks at NDCs in terms of the mitigation and adaptation actions being proposed by countries, you see a lot of practices included from agriculture that are in adaptation, right? Yeah. And it occurs to me that a good number of those are likely to lead to improved productivity and consequentially reducing emissions intensity. But it is a great question to know how you capture that in your national reporting. So Marta, do you want to have a go at answering that one? And then,
Yeah, it's a very good point. Thank you, George. I think you're totally right. And as long as we have an inventory, again, that has a level of disaggregation for activity data that would allow us to include those practices in the framework of the greenhouse gas estimation, we will be able to reflect the mitigation. But it has to be adapted to local conditions, to reflect national circumstances. For instance, the inclusion of legumes in grazing systems. And we tend to, if we include legumes, we improve soil fertility, we reduce nitrogen fertilizer use, and we are saying as well that we reduce methane emissions and direct fermentation emissions because the different components that legumes have. So, but we need to reflect in inventory the presence of these pastures. So if we have grazing systems, we need to be able to reflect the sort of grazing system we have, so that we are able to account for the reductions in those emissions. So I think it's totally possible, but we need to have an adequate level of disaggregation, and which is really, really important, activity data to back up that in the inventory. And that's one of the main challenges we face as inventory compilers. You can have default emission factors, and you can find in the literature emission factors that will be more adapted to your conditions. But if you don't have activity data to complement those emission factors in your inventory, then there is no way of including those. So I think that's the main challenge.
Thanks, Marta. Herwig, did you want to add something there? You're on mute, Herwig. You're on mute.
Yes, sorry. Marta nearly said it all. I just wanted to add that this in the EU, where we have the same issues, that of course, because of this bookkeeping system we have in place, we need to separate adaptation and mitigation somewhere. But on the other hand, in real life, there's many actions that do both. That's why we wouldn't focus on one or the other. I mean, sometimes you can call it climate action or actions to improve sustainability or whatever, because it has led to a lot of very tense discussions on what is more important. But actually, the important thing is that we do something. And that's in the EU what we try to do, but just to admit that we also have our obligations to tell people what we do in adaptation, what we do in mitigation. But agriculture is the one and only sector where this is really difficult. I mean, maybe there's other sectors where you also have some difficulties, but I don't think it's at the same level as in agriculture.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, continue down the list of questions. George, I'll just draw your attention. There is a question further down the list which is directed to you. If you want to answer that one just by typing, asking which countries you're actually working with, the 6 countries you mentioned. And while you're doing that, we have a question about the social, political, economic dimension of this. And this was emphasized in particular by Brian and by Brenna. The question is, what social science research topics could make the biggest contribution to progressing the mitigation agenda? Brenna, do you want to have a go at that first, and we can ask others?
Sure. This is actually something we're just starting to work on in Canada. And it's when we started to have the conversations about mitigation options that were appropriate for different production systems and environments across Canada. We started talking about things like rotational grazing, and this is a great option that's available for producers. And we asked the question of what are you willing to do and not willing to do? And I think on the social side, we need to understand non-financial barriers to adopting some of these recommended practices. And one of the ones for rotational grazing that came up is the guys who they've been zapped by an electric fence and they never want to experience that again. And it's one of those ones of there's nothing financial about it. This is a producer's personal preference and choice, and understanding what are those barriers on the social side that are actually going to potentially limit or be a roadblock in terms of communicating the adoption and uptake of those practices. Another one is understanding what risk level producers are willing to take and where are they willing to take risks. So Marta mentioned inclusion of legumes. So establishment of some of those new stands of legumes are higher success factors in some environments and higher risk of lack of establishment in other environments. That can be a real barrier to adoption for some producers of they may be willing to take risk elsewhere in their production system, but not there. And so understanding, are they willing to take risks on the marketing side, on the productivity side, on the labor side of how much labor are they willing to put in or not? And is that a barrier, and is technology a potential solution or not?
Great, thanks. I didn't expect the electric fence to be part of that answer, but it's very real. And having come from a farm and having been shocked by electric fences, I can agree. It's not desirable, and certainly not on a wet, cold winter morning. Alvaro, your turn, and perhaps you'll bring in some rice reflections here. There was an earlier question on the balances between gases, which is of course very true in the rice production, and you know, water management is often seen as a big solution for rice mitigation, but that would come presumably with some potential risks or economic issues. So yeah, great to have your reflections.
Yeah, so let me address the 2 points, the interaction between gases. Yeah, that's a common issue in the rice sector. You know, we are pushing for a new water management strategy that is called alternative wetting and drying, and that's have a very clear effect on decreasing methane emission. But you can also increase N2 emissions. So at the end, you need to look to see the combination of the two. Of the two systems. So that's a clear example of how can you increase one gas and you can decrease the other one. But the other topic that I would like to address is this issue of the social, because I think there is a clear need to put more people from this background in this perspective. And I guess that's what I tried to reflect on my presentation, is how you do the distribution of the different incentive and cost regarding, you know, methane emission or carbon sequestration or net zero production. We need people from that. I talk about profitability, but it can be other incentive that farmers, you know, are achieving. Not everything is money, but it has to be some kind of incentive. So I really happy to see more social, especially from the communication point of view, in light of this issue.
Sorry, I'm muted. Brian, would you like to add something?
Just a bit on this, and it's something, and I'm sorry, Rana, you've probably heard me say this before at Coronevi, but farmers are tangible people, and they like to see somebody else has done the change and survived. They don't need to be hugely profitable, but they just need to know they're still in business. And they know that what they've been doing for the last 30, 40 years may not be perfect, but they've survived. And it's just about giving them the confidence to change. And when we talk about the risks, I think when we're looking at asking farmers to change, we need to talk about and understand the social dimension, which sort of comes to the point of saying, we've got your back. If this fails, we'll make sure the risk is mitigated. We're not going to give you cash, but if this new approach fails, we'll look after you. And it's about giving them the confidence to change. And back to the social bit, I think it goes not just on working with farmers and mitigation, it goes back to the beginning of research. And the greatest learning I got out of these FAO stats, when we look at dairy research, for example, we're often looking at 100 cows plus to make something viable, whereas the average herd size globally is 3 cows. The number of herds globally with more than 100 cows is less than 0.5% of all the herds in the world. How do we design mitigation activities can service those farms? Because that's our majority, and that's where we're going to have the impact. So it's how do we give those guys the opportunity to learn new skills and give them the confidence to change.
I guess having their actions and their efforts reflected and visible, albeit small incremental gains, is part of that motivation factor, right? It's part of that incentive.
Well, often in those situations, Hayden, they're not incremental gains. They're actually quite substantial compared to the more developed markets. It's where you can get your greatest wins.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, so we'll keep going down the list of questions. The next one is flipping it around a wee bit. So the question is, or the commenting question is, that greenhouse gas emissions are not an agricultural problem, but a food systems problem. Given that we need to get to zero net carbon mid-century, what cannot be mitigated will need to be offset. And how do we get the consumer to pay for mitigation and offsetting? Anyone like to have a comment on that? Herwig, do you have anything to say there on the farm to fork? Is that relevant in this context? I'm thinking of, presumably fork relates to the consumer.
Well, I might leave the question of who will make the consumer pay to somebody else. But in any case, yes, our farm to fork strategy is linked to that. Also, what we have in the CAP reform, we have, maybe I can already answer, there was another question about being climate neutral by 2050. It's all linked, so every sector needs to reduce. Some sectors need to make sure that we have more carbon stored. And in the EU, this will only work if we increase the removals and the stored carbon in soils and forests. And if we do some BECCS, some kind of carbon capture and storage, but also if we change habits. Now you can't force people to change habits, you can incentivize them. And part of it is going to be through communication, a lot of communication, to have a back and forth also with our citizens. I mean, they pay for our salaries and we are there to make sure that they continue their life as they're used to, and administrate this whole big construct, which is the EU, together with the member states. So the thing we can do is we can inform, we can communicate, and that's what's going to happen quite a lot. We already have examples for that. We have a promotion policy for agricultural products, which has a very high focus on sustainability now. There's school fruit and milk schemes that have been running since years. Our colleagues from DG-Sante have a number of initiatives running where they try to inform people about possibilities to have more healthy diets and what they could buy instead of what they're buying now, let's say. But again, it's the consumer's choice. People are already paying their taxes, and we need to make sure that one way or another we have a buy-in from the population. But it's not only the people in charge of administration, it will be through the efforts of NGOs, of basically everybody involved. Also farmers themselves, if you change your practice and you work in a more sustainable way and you want valorization of your product, then you will automatically talk to your clients also, to potential clients, and you will enumerate the advantages of your product that is now much more greener and is better for the health and so forth. So I think all that together will help us to get there. Now on selling carbon storage, as I said before, the EU is looking into a model for carbon farming. We also looked at different models that exist already in private industry. You have a number of companies that have actions running with farmers in different countries, like McDonald's, Nestle, and others, if I'm allowed to say names. And we will see where that gets us. The main difficulty is the conflict, as is mentioned, between this private approach, and we are in a discussion on inventories. So somehow there has to be a link between what you have in your inventory that you send to the UN and you want to show other countries what you're doing, and what is done by, in this case, sometimes multinational companies. And then the question also needs to be asked, well, where does the credit end up? So you do not sell it twice or 3 times or 4 times or whatever. So
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Sorry,
George. That's okay. That's okay. We've got just over 15 minutes, so we're going okay. But yeah, George, if you can add something there, and then we can go to the next question.
I'll be very, very brief. Hayden, the challenge you have from a policy perspective is the changing terminologies. They change faster than the policy, the way your countries change policies. And as a consequence, it becomes a problem where a particular, for example, now food systems is a buzzword now, but doesn't exist in many of our African agriculture policies, simply because they adopted, for example, value chain approach, which I don't know whether scientists or experts is the same as food systems. And so I would, and of course, from the negotiations, I think we have also had a problem where new terminologies come, for example, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, and the rest. So you start asking yourself, what's the relationship between these terminologies? And from a policy perspective, what do we do? I recall it took us quite a while, since 2015 to almost 2018, to get a climate smart agriculture framework for Kenya. And then once we adopted it, then we got some representation that we need to do a policy on agroecology. And then we asked, what's the difference? If you can tell us the difference and the need to have a separate policy for agroecology, then we'll be happy to do that. But we didn't get any of that. And so I think what I want to request the experts and scientists is that you need to be alive, that you need to be in tandem to the policy in order for your ideas and need to be implemented. But what I pick from food systems is, from Africa perspective, is the food loss. Whereas in EU, changing of diet may be the priority, but for us, food loss is a key issue, because we lose almost 40% of what we produce through various ways, and that part is part of the emission, and we must find solution for it, because if that food was properly kept or saved, then we will not be importing food, because we'll be food secure. And so for me, food systems is good, but we may need to pick the elements that could support what is already existing in the policy, and then build on that, as opposed to the push that we now need to have a framework for food systems and the rest. Over to you, Hayden.
Thanks, George. No, I certainly appreciate that comment, because it is hard to keep up sometimes with the new words and paradigms and ideologies, and what are you going to call them, being thrown into the international arena. So it is really important to translate it concretely into those steps that are beginning to be taken by industry, by government, which can have a lag, right? And just as you're starting to implement something, it's moved on to something else, and you think, is it relevant? And we're doing the wrong thing. And often it's the same thing, but it's just been rebranded. Look, we'll just have a look at the questions. So this was partially answered by Herwig, but I think I might open it up for others to comment on. There's an observation here that there are a growing or a number of examples of individual farms or companies potentially using the services of consultants to sell carbon storage. And the questions for the panelists are, do you think there's a problem if there are differences in the way these different consultants approach monitoring and measuring and selling carbon storage? And how might we reconcile, if there is a conflict, between this type of activity and the national targets, which is what Herwig alluded to in terms of selling carbon credits, who buys them, who claims them, where are they registered? Any reflections there in terms of private standards, voluntary standards, etc.? Brian, you want to go first? I know you've been involved with some work.
Yeah, well, we had the same concerns. So we published a document, which I'll put in the chat in a minute, but on carbon trading in the dairy sector, because I was concerned in Europe, we do have consultants going up farm drives and offering farmers money for what are you doing with your grassland, and we'll pay you some money, which is very attractive to a farmer. And the concern from the dairy sector point of view was actually we might need those emissions reductions, whatever they are, in our own value chain, as opposed to their dairy processor having to go out and buy credits on an open market. So we just did a very basic guidance document on what does it mean for the dairy sector carbon trading. And I've just put in the chat already, we're just about to release the final version of a carbon sequestration methodology. And the difference between what we're proposing here and what it's almost a very basic tier 1 approach the consultants are taking to sell credits, it's very different. And a lot of dairy companies are nervous about going near it because they might get caught out for greenwashing or doing something wrong. Whereas these things, it is the words we use, it's the Wild West out there at the moment. There's no regulation. And it is a big concern for us. What I'm told is that the NGOs are working on it now and trying to get something in line. Well, why are we waiting for the NGOs? Why aren't we getting behind it as an industry and saying this is an accurate way to do it? This is the science and this is how we do it. So we have the same concerns, and we started with this publication, which I'll put in the chat, just to bring the dairy sector up to speed and to get dairy processors to think about the implications for their business, their farmer suppliers, and the impact of the greenhouse gas emissions from those farms in their own value chain.
You're on mute, Hayden.
Sorry, sorry. I was saying, George, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, very quickly. I think let's look at where we are right now in the Paris Agreement. We now made progress in Glasgow on Article 6 and particularly Article 6.2, which is cooperative approaches, and Article 6.4, which is a CDM-like mechanism. I think the agriculture fraternity, we have not been very progressive and in trying to define how we want to use these mechanisms. And I think there's an opportunity that we may need to look at. From what I hear Brian saying, that probably could be under 6.4. But under 6.2, where it's cooperative approaches, a country to country, cooperation and the rest, that may be a different arrangement. And so my request, Hayden, is that we want to incentivize farmers. Can we look at the instruments that are being made available under the Paris Agreement and see to what extent agriculture family can benefit? I think there's a knowledge gap there. Because one of the things I've done with my colleagues in Kenya and Africa when we're meeting is to ask them, tell me, how is Africa going to benefit, particularly agriculture, be incentivized through Article 6? And I don't think we have an answer. And therefore, Hayden, some work around that to help us unpack how agriculture and more so livestock could be part of this Article 6, whether 6.2, which is cooperative approaches, if we fear 6.4, I think that would be good. But also we have 6.8, which is supposed to be non-market, but catalyzing more investment in those areas that are important for countries. So for me, let's look at a broader perspective and let's and find some scientific approach to this challenge. Otherwise, we're going to miss out. I'm sorry. And yet agriculture, as we know from Africa, is that ODA is decreasing in agriculture, and therefore we must find innovative ways of financing agriculture if we have to feed our people and keep our economies running. Over to you, Hayden.
Thanks very much, George. So I think that's partially answered that question. I'm just looking down the list now.
Hayden, there was this comment by Sergio, and I know Sergio is one of my team members. I think Sergio, we agree that data is still a problem in many countries, and in my view, the cooperation that we're having with the New Zealand government and the GRA and the rest to put a community of practice for livestock is one such cooperation that will overcome that challenge. And it was amazing that within a very short time that we started, we had already documented over 70, I think, scientists and experts in livestock across Africa that were to be involved in this. So I would urge, and I think I've seen Andreas here, I would urge that we strategize and see how we can build on the already work that we have started on the community of practice of livestock for Africa, so that we move from tier 1 to tier 2 and eventually tier 3, and I think that will be progressive. Over to you, Hayden.
Yeah, no, thanks, George. I was hoping to get to that question, so you've addressed it. And I guess often, being the inventory compiler, and at least in most cases in the Ministry for the Environment or that agency, it's probably a very lonely job, and you don't necessarily have access to all of the data and the knowledge that's out there in the research community and the agricultural community. So it's really vital to have, as you say, this large group of scientists across the region involved and engaged, because they will be a great resource for the compilers who have that unenviable task of compiling national inventories and reporting them every 1 or 2 years, depending on the country. So no, it's great to see that kind of work happening. Alvaro, you want to jump in on this, or any particular question?
Yeah, just looking at the time, there was a question at the beginning regarding this issue of sustainability, measuring emission factors and removal factor and carbon sequestration, and how we consider the externalities of this. And I think that's a very important issue. We should not only concentrate everything regarding carbon. This is of course, this is a global issue, and there is a climate change, affecting us, and the solution is globally, but we cannot lose the importance of the local environment. What I'm trying to say is we cannot develop net zero agricultural industry or sector, but affecting water quality, biodiversity, all these other issues. So the point is that this is a global problem, there are global solutions, but we need to take care of the externality, especially of the other ecosystem service.
Thanks, Alvaro. That's great. Yeah, there's a few questions touching on similar things here. One that seems to be coming back, which was related to the food system question, is it's really, how can we try to better translate the inventory approaches that, of course, are are strict, right, in terms of the guidelines that Marta referred to. There are methodologies that are used and updated and refined over time, but there's a certain, approach taken in terms of what sectors and sources are included within agriculture, etc. But then, as we know, from a food system perspective, you have imports, exports, consumer demand. and you bring in other sectors in the value chain, to use George's words earlier, you know, in terms of energy, industrial processes, transportation, etc. So like, I guess there's just a general question of like, how can we better bring together the inventory approach in agriculture with this wider systems perspective? And I guess what role do you as different actors in that ecosystem play, you know, as industry, as government, as research? Like what are effective means to try to do that, to reconcile some of the different methodological approaches, the different perspectives, the different drivers that each have? Does anyone want to just make some kind of closing remarks, because it is coming up to the end of our time, and it's maybe a place to finish on?
Well, Hayden, this connects, but not necessarily directly, because I think this is one where we are putting a lot of expectations on producers in agriculture to be reporting data. Marta mentioned the activity data that's needed for the national inventory reports, but we have industry goals that require industry sectors collecting data, and we have supply chains and individual companies who've made commitments and goals and are going to be pressed to collect data. And I think it's one of coming back to the earlier comments about creating systems in order to share data so that we can have alignment, because one of the key things here is recognizing, yes, we have diversity. We have diversity in every country in terms of production systems and environments that producers are operating in, but it doesn't mean that disaggregated data that gives us lots of high accuracy on an individual farm, once we roll it up at the national level, it can very much support that national inventory reporting that needs to be done. But how do we actually do this so that we actually ease the response burden on producers, and therefore also increase the accuracy of the data and the numbers that we are using at every single level?
Right. Anyone else? Everyone's in violent agreement. Marta, I see you thinking there. I'll force you to turn your thoughts into
I
words.
don't think it's a difficult one. It's because it's complex, and we all agree that agricultural systems are complex in themselves. I think we need to look at stakeholders that we are collaborating to take this forward, and understanding that we need to maintain the temperature of the planet, or the increase of the temperature around 1.5 degrees Celsius. That we need to understand that it's complex and there is uncertainty, and those words will be part of our language for the next 50 years. And we need to do the best we can, considering the uncertainty and the differences in the methodologies and etc. So I think that the farm system approach reflects our real life. I think one thing we didn't mention before is to consider the power of consumers. I think they are willing to pay. It depends on the society, of course, and the national income. But I think in general, in some circumstances, that they will be willing to pay for a sustainable production system. We have to remember as well that 30% or more of the total food produced in the world is lost, is wasted, is never used. So we have all these emissions that have been accounted for and produced, but no one is using that food, and we need to reduce those values. And there, the power of consumers, including everything from the industry forwards, we need to be aware of those and do our best. So if we manage to reduce the total amount of food waste, nitrous oxide emissions globally will be reduced by more than 10% globally, which is loads. So we need to account for those things as well.
Yes.
Yes.
That's a good point. It is quite stark, isn't it, when you put it in those sorts of numbers at a global level. Okay, so look, we're at time. So unless any of our panelists have anything they desperately need to add, I think we can close the webinar. I would like to thank all of you, the panelists, first, for your time and making yourself available with your perspectives and your expertise. It's been a really interesting discussion. We've had a lot of questions from the audience. We've attempted to answer most and combine them where possible. I guess there's a possibility for following up with some of those questions following the webinar. The webinar will be made available online on the GRA website, at least to begin with, so you can all see it again or pass it to people who have missed it. And as Hazel mentioned at the beginning, there is the second webinar in this series taking place, and Matt, perhaps I'll ask Hazel or Katya to just share the link again in the chat before we close so people can register for that, which will start to get into, you know, different aspects of this question of inventories and greenhouse gas reporting. So thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at the next installment. And there's the link in the chat just in time.